vacations you make, the buildings you live and work in, the transportation you take was all designed and built by civil engineers. Today, we're going to talk about that particular kind of civil infrastructure called transportation, how it enables our everyday lives, but also how it impacts our environment, its implications on social equity, and because of that, how important it is that people like you and people like me engage in where and how it is built. Because we know above all, we want to build sustainable, equitable cities for us and the people who will come after us. In this session, 3 panelists, all professors in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering, will explore urban engineering and innovative mobility, the environment, equity, and engagement. I'll introduce the panelists as they take their turn. After all 3 panelists have spoken, they'll join me for a short discussion, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Please post your questions in the chat, and I will try to get to as many as I can. You can pose your questions to one of our panelists, any of our panelists, many of our panelists. Let's get on with it. Our first speaker is Professor Eric Miller. Eric, please join me on the stage. Cities can be characterized as complex systems of systems. Professor Eric Miller's research focuses on the interactions of those systems. Professor Miller is particularly interested in the relationship between land use, which determines where we live, work, shop, play, and study, and the transportation system, which enables us to get from where we live to where we work, shop, play, and study. Today, Professor Miller will talk about the very, very long and illustrious history of civil engineering, taking us quickly through 6,000 years of urban civilization designed and built by civil engineers. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Judy, and it's my pleasure to be here. Welcome everyone to this session. Yes, so the history of cities and the history of civil engineering. Lewis Mumford, who was a great 20th century urbanist, famously described cities as the containers of civilization. For over 6,000 years, from Uruk, the world's first city founded on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers around 4000 BC, to the megacities of today, Tokyo, Shanghai, New York, London, and so many others, cities have been the world's marketplaces and the epicenters of power, innovation, society, and so much more. Over a decade ago, we passed a major watershed. For the first time in human history, over 50% of the world's population lives in urban areas. As Judy mentioned already, in Canada, it's over 80%. I think as Canadians, we don't think of ourselves as city people. You know, we think of the wide open spaces and so forth, but the reality is urban regions are literally our homes and workplaces. They are where we live our lives, build our businesses, and collectively co-create who we are as a people. This long urban history has only been possible due to the work of civil engineers, whether we called ourselves those in the days, in the time of the pharaohs or not, who throughout history have designed and built the houses and temples and warehouses and other buildings that comprise the physical city. But equally important, they design, build, and operate the infrastructure systems that enable cities to function. The water, sanitation, energy, communications, and transportation systems that support human life and interactions within the physical city, that turn a static collection of buildings into a dynamic, living, social economic ecosystem. Each of these systems is a critical piece of the overall complex puzzle that is the city. Clean water, as but one example, is fundamental to a healthy, livable city. Our modern cities, which are largely healthy places, have everything to do with clean water supply, as opposed to the 19th century cities, for instance, where disease was rampant because of poor water supply. So all of these systems are extremely important to us. But this afternoon, in the short time available to us, we're going to focus on transportation, on the mobility systems that provide access to activities and that allow people, goods, and services to move efficiently within, into, and out of our urban systems. Transportation systems and mobility services are a major research focus at the University of Toronto, both within the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering and across the broader university community. UTRI has over 40 faculty associates working across the spectrum of mobility questions, from intelligent, real-time control of traffic flows, to next-generation transit systems, to the role of mobility in maximizing social welfare and economic productivity. As in many spheres of today's world, transportation is undergoing massive disruptions due to technological innovation, profound shifts in social and political structures, and of course, as we've all been experiencing over the past 15, 16 months, the COVID-19 pandemic. It is a challenging time for the transportation field in terms of global scale problems and opportunities. It's also a great time to be a transportation engineering planner, to be able to have direct influence in so many ways on how we live our lives and build our cities. Today, our panel is going to briefly explore a few of these urban mobility challenges and opportunities through three important lenses: environmental sustainability, equity, and engagement. These three E's of environment, equity, and engagement cannot be considered in isolation. As Judy mentioned, we're big believers that in the concept of systems and systems of systems, which are characterized by the city. So given that the city is this complex interplay of systems and concerns and issues, holistic approaches that understand the interconnections between our economic, physical, and social systems are needed to find the win-win solutions that are needed to build the 21st century cities that we need and desire. To begin this discussion, I will now turn the floor back over to our moderator, who will introduce the panelists and get us launched into our exploration of urban mobility. Over to you, Judy.
And thank you very much, Eric. Our next panelist is Professor Marianne Hatzopoulou. Marianne, go ahead and join me on the stage. Transportation is the highest emitter of greenhouse gases by sector in the province of Ontario. Professor Marianne Hatzopoulou's main research interest is modeling road transport emissions, urban air quality, and population exposure to air pollution. Professor Hatzopoulou studies how our own daily activities generate traffic emissions, and then how we are exposed to them. Where do these emissions come from, and who's exposed to them? Today, Professor Hatzopoulou will talk about transportation, mobility, the emissions they create, and implications of those emissions on social equity. Thank you. Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Judy, and hi, everyone. I want to pick up where Professor Miller left off. In the last maybe minute of his talk, he mentioned two very important things: holistic and COVID-19. And I don't think anyone can talk about anything today without mentioning COVID-19. I want to start a little bit about talking about equity. And COVID-19 was the greatest example. It wasn't great, but it was a very good example about how social inequity was exacerbated, highlighted, and how a lot of flaws and the mistakes that we've done in city design, in transportation systems, were very apparent. They're in our face. And I want to talk a little bit about that. When we think about, implications of cities engineering and mobility planning, we're faced with these examples of disproportionate access to transportation and urban amenities across populations, right? People living in different neighborhoods have vastly different opportunities to access jobs, healthcare, healthy food, green space, largely because of their neighborhood itself and how their neighborhood is designed. But the relationship between neighborhood design and opportunities, right, also has massive repercussions on, health and the environment. And these repercussions are so large that studies have shown that where you live is a large determinant of your health, from the air you breathe, the parks and the public spaces where you can walk and exercise. Even greenness in its own right has been associated with health benefits. And if you think about it, the idea that where you live can determine your life expectancy really tells us that we have designed inequitable cities and transportation systems. That transportation systems and services and all types of urban amenities are not distributed equitably across urban residents. And even more so, not surprisingly, the neighborhoods that access these services the least are also the neighborhoods with the highest levels of socioeconomic deprivation. So now looking forward, we're witnessing these massive transportations in our mobility systems, from high ride-hailing services, on-demand transit, self-driving vehicles, electric vehicles, robots delivering your mail. And we have a duty to ensure that these technologies can close the equity gap rather than further exacerbate it, and that the benefits of new technologies are actually distributed fairly in terms of access to these technologies, but also in terms of the environmental benefits of these technologies. So what are some opportunities to include equity in mobility research? Number one, and Professor Miller said that, holistically. We have to look at the system holistically. Very often, we can start with very good intentions. Let's give you an example. You look at the neighborhood, a low-income neighborhood, and you say, well, let's start greening this neighborhood. Let's plant more trees and let's install an e-bike station because there is no bus stop, for people to quickly access public transit. But then you do this and you realize that what you've done is perhaps drive an uncontrollable increase in housing costs and property values and gentrification. How do we not make these mistakes? Well, if we look holistically at housing and transportation and the environment together, we are less prone to making those kind of mistakes. Number two, I think we have to start thinking less about target-driven milestones and more about how to get there. When I say target-driven milestones, and that's a self-criticism first to myself and my research, always thinking, well, if we get to 50% electric vehicle penetration, we're going to drive greenhouse gas reductions by that much and air pollution is going to be reduced by that much. But how do we get there? We can't just say, well, if we subsidize electric vehicles, people will buy them. Who will buy them? Who is going to have access to them? Who is going to first have access to these new technologies? How do we make sure that they're distributed equitably? So thinking more about these policy mechanisms and how we implement them rather than focusing always on the end game, on the target. We need to start thinking less about economic metrics too, and more about socially beneficial actions, right? How do we bridge, economic metrics, but also with social beneficial actions? We need to normalize discussion around equity. It has to become, part of the way we do research. And then giving a little plug and a segue to the speaker who's coming after Professor El-Diraby, I think one of the most crucial ways to ensure equity in our research and our policy is community engagement. We got to talk to communities. We have to ask them what they want, what it is that they need, and help them and teach them to understand their role in the policy process. So with this, I end my little pitch, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this panel. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Professor Hatzopoulou. Thank you very much for that, and also for your early introduction of our final panelist, Professor Tamer-El-Diraby. Professor El-Diraby's research interests focus on construction projects and project management, both classic civil engineering focus areas. Professor El-Diraby joins me. Thank you. He hopes to fundamentally shift the ways we design and manage construction projects to empower communities of citizens to co-create more sustainable facilities, and through collaborative behavioral change, operate these facilities for the benefits of their own communities. Almost all of us live in cities. We all use transportation. Doesn't it make sense that we would have a say in the way the city transportation system is built? Today, Professor El-Diraby will talk about why citizen engagement is so important to the co-creation of sustainable, equitable transportation and cities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. It's my pleasure to be on this panel. I'm going to discuss the relationship between infrastructure and communities. And I will do that through two main dimensions. The first is, what do we mean by engagement? There are several levels of engagement that we look at. And then the implication of that on equity, especially in a futuristic smart city. So the levels of engagement, there is a famous ladder for engagement that covers 9 levels of engagement. I will summarize them here in just 3 main levels. The first is that we engineers, being knowers, and we know the best, design the infrastructure for the people. I'm sure that the Pharaoh back in Egypt said, I want a pyramid, and everything was done. Up till recently, I'm sure also Mr. Gardner, who was the chief engineer for the city of Toronto, just said, okay, well, it makes sense to have the Gardner going this way. And so the first approach is that we know and we design for the community. This progressed with the urbanization to a level of we should consult the community. And we see this currently in the form of the environmental impact assessment process. There's a lot of concerns about the quality of this process, and what comes out of it, most probably one-way discussion, sometimes a two-way discussion. But the future looks at a smart city where citizen scientists are engaged in the process. They are not engaged to comment on the design. They are not engaged to communicate their ideas. They are not even engaged to make the actual decision. They are engaged to develop the design, to innovate ideas, to come up with their own views about things, how to be done, and then discuss them. And so I like very much the word empowerment that is at the title of our panel, because the purpose of infrastructure in a smart city is to empower people, not engineers, but people, to innovate new ideas, to have ownership of their assets, and to be progressive enough to be able to handle this with the support of engineers, of course. But they are in the driver's seat, again, not in the decision-making, but in the innovation and the knowledge creation. The concept of co-creation, where citizens are knowledgeable enough and their knowledge is respected to the fact that it is on par with engineering and architectural knowledge, is the new trend that is going to happen in the smart city. In fact, smart city should be seen as a smart hardware, which we have progressed very well in. Amazingly interesting learning and artificial intelligence and data sciences. But the third most important pillar is citizen scientists, citizens who can use all of that to innovate new thinking, new ideas, and new products. The second level that we can discuss this on relates to the equity. And I will address that in two areas. I guess the medium to far future of driverless cars and the use of artificial intelligence in mobility systems. When we observed what happened when the regular car was introduced, we noted that there is a variety of business models that were created. Like there was no insurance companies, there was no gas stations. So what kind of opportunities are going to be created to communities when the driverless car comes? What kind of business model is going to be used to make sure that everybody benefit from that new invention? And the second relates to artificial intelligence. What kind of rules should artificial intelligence, I guess, be directed to do? What kind of learning should it be allowed to do? And what kind of control and governance on the results of artificial intelligence that can be, I guess, allowed in a smart city? Let's, for example, imagine that Google or Apple are the organizations that are running the driverless cars in our city. What kind of things can be allowed? Can they like deviate the cars from affluent areas to not affluent areas? Can they impact the zoning in one way or the other? And how much, for me as a citizen who doesn't have enough knowledge of artificial intelligence, can benefit from that? So thank you, and I'll turn it back to Judy.
Thank you very much, Professor El-Diraby. Don't leave, don't leave. Come back. I'd like to now invite all the panelists to join me on the stage so we can discuss this a bit further. And after we've had a bit of a discussion, we're going to turn it over to the Q&A in just a few minutes. So please remember, you're invited to post questions in the chat, and I will try to get to as many of them as I can. And you can direct your question at one of our panelists, Professor Eric Miller, Marianne Hatzopoulou, Tamer-El-Diraby, to one of them, to any of them, to many of them, or I will direct it as best I can. Okay, so looking forward to seeing your questions, and thank you everybody for your comments. I'm going to kick this off by saying, Professor Hatzopoulou says we've built inequitable cities. How did that happen? Does anybody want to comment on how do we end up in this place?
Well, there's probably many answers to that. Part of it is very classic land economics, in that we largely live in a free market society, for better or for worse. We can debate all of that. But land has value. Land tends to develop to what economists and developers would call the highest and best use, which means the most valuable use. Traditionally, certainly central cities have been viewed as very primary attractive places. So people bid up the value, and the people with money, the businesses with money, will buy into areas that are most attractive to them, and they can afford to outbid other people. And so poor people, lower income people, lower value businesses tend to be pushed to the periphery traditionally. And the role of transportation in this is a very key one, in that the role of transportation is to provide accessibility. We make land accessible. We make it possible to connect with activities. And so by putting a highway here or a subway there, we're changing that relationship in land. We're making some locations more accessible, more attractive, and hence more valuable. And so, Marianne mentioned the gentrification process, again, higher income people, higher income businesses tend to outbid others, and we as a society have, in a sense, allowed that to happen. And so the question is, what is a new economy, if you will, that would lead to a more equitable outcome, and how do we invest in transportation in a way that doesn't generate the further these inequities? I would also just say, and then I'll shut up because I'm already talking too long, it's not just transportation. Again, that we've used the word holistic several times. It's not just the transportation system, but it's what we build on the land. Where do we put houses of what sort? Where do we put the stores? Where do we put the offices? Because that's the other side of accessibility, is a road or a transit system will connect you to something, but what's the something? So the other way of improving, let's say, for example, accessibility to stores, jobs, healthcare services, let's say in low-income neighborhoods, it's not necessarily to build a new transit line, it's to build stores and community centers in the neighborhood so people can walk or take a local bus, et cetera, et cetera. So there's two sides of that coin, the urban form itself, and then how transportation connects it.
Professor Hatzopoulou, you talked about lessons from COVID. If there was going to be one lesson that transportation planners would learn, what do you think that would be?
I would say that the greenhouse gas reductions that were associated with the reduction in traffic during COVID were just large as what we would expect with a 50% penetration of electric vehicles. So there you have it. Modifying human behavior can have a very big impact on greenhouse gas reduction. It's measurable. I think a lot of skeptics were thinking, oh yeah, people modify behavior, maybe something will change, but maybe it's not so small that we can't measure it. We just learned that there's a lot of changes that are large enough that they can be measurable. And nobody's saying that this is how things should proceed, but this should tell us something about how we are behaving.
And the impact we have, and who, I think this is a horrible 15 months now that we've all been through in so many ways. And everybody's experienced it in their own particular way, and yet we've seen, a future that we would like to see, right? Way cleaner cities, better air, and we know that, and you're the expert here, but I'm sure that people are listening to us also have their own experiences of the impacts of dirty air on their health, or if not their health, somebody that's very close to them, because it's a pervasive problem, right? And everybody's experienced, the joys of being pretty close to home or wherever it is you called home for the short while. And, just being enabled by whatever you had access to. Some of us that's a lot, and some of us that's less so. So, Professor El-Diraby, talk about maybe coming out of this, what would we like? What would we like? A smart city, as you described it, enabled somehow by its citizens for its citizens. What would that be like?
Well, there's going to be a variety of things that has to change, whether it's the funding or planning for the transit system, putting an economic benefit to green economy, and boosting more smarter and greener technologies. All of that is on the hardware, maybe economic level, but I try to focus on the business model and the governance model. I think the long-term change that we need to have with a smart city is to look for a different governance model and get out of the traditional way that we have been doing business. Luckily, here in Toronto, we had been exposed to sidewalk labs. Whether you like it or not, the issues that sidewalk labs brought up are the challenges that we are seeing in the future. And most of them are, but I guess the good or bad thing about sidewalk lab is that they together and they'll chuck the system. And so I don't see much of a big challenge in rolling out technology. This society is well educated and will be able to use it. But the fundamental thinking change in the way we make decisions should be changed. And I guess as a case example, the breaking ground for the subway/transit system in Scarborough gives you an example of where the challenges are.
Yeah, that just yesterday, the day before, breaking ground for the subway in Scarborough, that transit extension, and finally building out transit in our area, in our city. The more the merrier, and what we have here. So we have 3 engineering professors talking about changing governance models, talking about making the air cleaner, talking about improving the cities we live in as systems of systems. What would you introduce in engineering education, if you could? What's in your dreams for how you would train the engineers of the future? I presume we have some students listening to us today.
Well, I can start. About 10 years ago, I started a graduate course on the business of smart city, the idea of how to govern the smart city and how can we use the knowledge in a smart city operation and making it more effective and thinking beyond the traditional scope. We also were lucky to receive funding from the Dean's Strategic Fund to build a occupant-centered digital twin of buildings. And this is where we will make a replica of the building data, and there you can experiment with futures, generate additional futures. And at the center of that are the students and the staff who are working on the buildings, actual buildings at U of T, where they will be having access to data. And then they will be given the opportunity to do some analytics about the data, generate new ideas, and share them and discuss them together. So a miniature of what should a smart city be, at least at the level of a building.
Very good. Marianne?
Yeah, I would say social history. Miller started his pitch with a history lesson to all of us, the history of cities. I think engineers should learn more about the history of cities and to better understand the mistakes that have been made in the past, understand why those mistakes have been made, right? Why land economics, and why economics, the role of economics, in shaping and designing cities. And we need to know more about social science. We can better implement, principles of social science in engineering design and in policy appraisal.
Yeah, I mean, super important, because we started off by saying civil engineering is about building cities, and it's people who live in cities. And I heard somebody say a couple of years ago, we're probably all new to being urbanists now and haven't really realized what it is to live in the city and understand the city and what forces have made our city. And Eric, over to you.
Well, Marianne stole my thunder, I think. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. I've been a long advocate that we need to be educating our engineers, sort of an intro course to social science. Economics is part of it. I think our engineers actually don't even get enough macroeconomics, but a bit of psychology, a bit of sociology, and also the politics and of science and engineering and of technology. We used to have a professor here, Bill Vandenberg, who taught these sorts of courses. He was not necessarily well received by either our colleagues, faculty members, or by the students. So, there's still an attitude among too many engineers that we crunch numbers and we build bridges, and this airy-fairy stuff doesn't matter. Well, it really does matter. I also recall that a former chair of civil engineering, Paul Young, when he was new to the department, he and I were having conversations, and I was urging him to think about civil engineering as urban engineering. And he picked up on it right away. And he says, yeah, we see all these pictures of buildings and roads and bridges. Where are the people? And so I think engineers have to realize that we are building things for people, not for cars, not for moving electrons over wires. It's the people. So bringing people into the engineering equation, I think, is very important.
Judy, can I add one side comment?
Please.
Given that we are giving history a big place in all of that, I'd like to, being originally from Egypt, to dispute Eric's assessment that the first city was in the Euphrates, not on the Nile. Just a side note.
we can argue about that.
So I guess, what a challenge we face. Here's the Faculty of Engineering running 2 days on empowering innovation. Innovation in engineering, of course, going gangbusters, all these people working on being so clever and creating new things. Tamer mentioned Sidewalk Labs, which had its foundations on introducing innovation into cities. So there's so much for people to learn. We're creating more and more for them to learn. It's getting more and more complex out there. And now we just added on to it. Everybody agreed about the importance of engineers, civil engineers, maybe in particular, understanding the context and the people that they're working for and with. So with that kind of a challenge, maybe we better talk about recruiting people who are not like us to work with us.
But I agree with that. But also, just while we're still on this education thing, maybe put in a plug for the faculty's Master of Engineering in City Engineering and Management, which I think is an undersubscribed program. But the intention of that really is exactly what we're trying to talk about, still within an engineering framework, to really broaden the perspective of engineers and to create city engineers, and really, as much as anything, hopefully building career paths so that engineers go into city management and become city leaders and urban designers. And so, there are courses there on cities as complex systems, on governance structures and so on. So I think that's a very interesting attempt by the faculty, which I think we could be doing more to build on, to create these kind of new engineers and bring other people to the table.
An excellent point, and I see that Emily has put into the chat that you can go find more about that program in the engineering education poster session. So she's encouraging all to check out that poster. And I see we have 3 questions in the chat. So we're going to wind this up soon, and I encourage people to, put their questions into the chat. And let's talk a bit about collaboration and working with people who are not us. And have you had any experience in that? And what does that kind of collaboration bring to your work?
I can start. I think collaboration is crucial nowadays, because the questions that the world is asking, or that cities are asking, are becoming way too complex, for single, views, for single expertise to tackle them. Great example, we're talking about transportation, right? And the previous question you asked was about technology, right? Technology will never save us on its own. Technology modifies our behavior. So there you go, right? You already have this very, very, evident connection between people developing new technologies and people trying to understand how these technologies are going to be used and how are they going to shape, how we move, where we live, how we travel, how we interact with that technology. So those are things we cannot tackle. We cannot understand the impacts of new technologies if we don't understand how people are going to use them and how are they going to be deployed in real world environment in cities. And then we have to understand what are the impacts on their environment, on public health. And I personally have had great connections with epidemiologists, and that has absolutely shaped the way I do my research and the way I view the impacts of transportation on the environment.
In my case, I had very good chances to work with the colleagues from social sciences and environment. For example, there is a university-wide initiative that relates to a campus as a living lab. It's not just about technology, but it's about enabling students to create ideas and experiment with them and study them as it relates to sustainability. I was also lucky to have a chance to work with the Toronto Region and Conservation Authority, which quite is a progressive organization that's trying to look at their asset management, so how to preserve the assets. But they are also starting to become convinced with this idea of citizen scientists. How can we encourage the citizens around their installations, their small dams, their small infrastructure, to record and come up with ideas and be part of the data collection system? And I see this as a quite a progressive move from them.
Very much. Eric?
Well, I've always worked, in particular, geographers, human geographers, looking at travel behavior, transportation, land use interactions. Frankly, the work I do could go on just as easily in the geography department or even an economics department as in engineering. So I've always, and I've, for my sins, ran an urban center here for a while, and I think one of the reasons I got the job is because I speak social science, and so I think and I even studied with a political scientist for a while when I was doing my PhD. So I've walked the walk with that a reasonable amount of my career, but there's always more you could do, I think.
Yeah, so it's going to take a village to build a city. Is that right? Okay, we do have some questions in the chat, so I'm going to turn to those now and encourage people to please keep posting your questions. The first one is for Tamer, and Ali, thanks very much for this question. Ali asks, where are we today at the public engagement level?
It's a very good question, and I can answer by not where we want to be. There is some progress that happened in the 70s and the 80s, and then there was stagnation. So before I guess the push for urbanization and the rights for communities, decisions were just made by engineers who knew the best solution. From the late 70s till the current time, we focused a lot on environmental assessment, and indirectly communities engaged in that. But the value of these engagements, the objectives of it, is just becoming part of the paperwork, especially when it comes to community engagement. I remember about 15 years ago, one of my graduate students wanted to see what are the lessons learned from all these environmental assessments. And we went to the ministry and said, could you give us like the last 100 of these to study them? And they said, we don't have them. We don't collect them. And that was the kind of scenario that we were talking about. In many cases, the options that are being exchanged in these discussions are almost the same. And in the overwhelming scenario, they yield, after consultation, the same design that the engineer developed. And so the situation is not the best. However, I have hope in the younger generation. The younger generation has, and we've seen that in many projects. For example, about 20 years ago, the mayor of Paris wanted to change a small market to be modernized. And he did the regular things. He invited architects, and the winning design was offered to the community to comment on it. And several people there said, no, we don't like this. This is not what we want. And for some reason, they made a coalition to challenge this. And as part of their challenge, they said, what do we want? And so they went to a site that was hype at that time called Second Life. And people from Paris, Canada, China, Japan, and other areas collaborated together and came up with a design on their own. Of course, it was amended later on. But this shows you that the younger generation are pushing for two things, to be more idealistic, protect the environment, enhance the equity, and other things that were not part of our education and practice before. And second, they want to be in the picture. They want to lead the discussion. They want to lead the generation of ideas, and they are demanding it. Again, I have to say some of that has reached developers, especially private developers. I heard that Sidewalk Labs used to have a budget of $50 million to engage the community throughout their project, not just like before the project, which means that they understand that this is critical for their success. And so the message is not lost on many other developers right now. There is a governmental level, municipal level movement toward better engagement? There are some talk about it, but there is nothing concrete in this regard. And hopefully our education to our students, whether it's in engineering or outside, will plant this idea, and as they go out as developers or government employees, they can implement some of that.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question about that, maybe for you or somebody else. I heard it said we might talk about putting in a new subway, and everybody thinks that's a good idea. And here's the alignment, and everybody thinks that's a good idea. And here's a station placement. And somebody says, whoa, that's on my street. That's not such a good idea. So, what do we do to get engagement to be about, the big questions, the big picture, the common good, and not about, staying away from my corner of the world?
Well, I have the flip side of that.
Okay, good.
Let me start with it. We did a study when the city was planning the Eglinton West corridor. And we noted that in the very initial environmental assessment study suggested 2 underground stations, one of them in Leslie Street. And then in a revised study, they found that there's not going to be too many people who are going to use this station. The station is literally under a park and is surrounded by high-rise buildings. So there is no expectation for increase from the current low numbers that are estimated. So they suggested to remove it or put it on street level. And at some point, some people from the community objected to that. And this time, instead of demonstrating, they went to Twitter. They created an account. Discussions became part of the public discourse. And it was the election cycle in the municipal level. So the council in the city decided that they will reinstate the 2 stations in underground format. And we looked at the communication that took place in this incident. What were people talking about, and what was the city talking about, and what was reported in the media as an independent third party. And we found complete discrepancies between them. Had they been able to talk in the same wavelength, maybe a different outcome could have, and we did not waste an estimated of $80 million on something that we may not need in the future.
Speaking a common language and maybe speaking on the same channels as well. Okay, I'm going to go to a question, Marianne, posed by somebody, triggered by something you said about gentrification. I'm not sure if you can answer this, but it's her question, thank you, Parveen, is about food security and access to healthier food. And she wonders if you have a comment on gentrification and what the impact on access to healthier food. And I guess we get access through transportation.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I am by no means an expert in food security, absolutely, but sure. I mean, there's all sorts of relationship between food. Food can drive gentrification. If you build you're not going to find a gluten-free bakery in a low-income neighborhood, right? And if in a low-income neighborhood, you're going to find gluten-free bakeries and vegan shops, and I don't know, a fancy fish taco little shop where, that you're going to possibly drive gentrification. So I think the solution is, how do we do it right? Is again, talking to communities, developing grocery stores that are needed in these neighborhoods, and starting first by understanding that food indeed can certainly drive gentrification in a neighborhood.
Yeah, and for anybody who's familiar with what's been going on in the Eglinton West neighborhood, so what happens in the city, we've called Toronto the city of neighborhoods, and people gather in the neighborhoods where they feel comfortable, and what happens in those neighborhoods is that the services, amenities, the foods, the kinds of things they like to do get placed in those neighborhoods around them. And when we see a higher order transportation system come in, can bring a new form of development, new kinds of people, new kinds of needs. And as we went back to the beginning of Eric talking about the land economics of what can change the land use there, which may be a big surprise to the people who have called that home for a long time. And we're going to have to keep an eye on that going forward for sure, for the people who live here. And you know, and we know we love to travel to those neighborhoods and see what's up, and the differences that are our strength and make it interesting, I think, to be in the city of Toronto. I've got one for everybody now, and it's a good one. Thank you very much, Adriano. You know, we could have had a whole talk on this, but Adriano asks, how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the future of cities in terms of movement of people and building of infrastructure? And what about, and what's the implications of hybrid work from home office? And how do you think that's going to affect us going forward? And I'm sure we could have gone on for the entire time about this, but Eric, what do you think? What do you think? So far, we're just thinking about the future of work and our mobility. You're on mute.
All right.
That's the very COVID thing that we landed on.
We have at least one you are on mute for every session. I mean, the short answer is nobody knows, but there's been whole conferences. Every week there's a conference someplace where people are debating these things. But I think among most urbanists I know, there's a loose consensus that yes, things will be different. And yes, for example, some people will continue working from home, but as opposed to what people were thinking a year ago, well, oh, this is the death of the downtown and no one's ever going to go into the office again. I think after a year of Zoom, people are very tired of it, and they're starting to recognize the social side of things, but the importance of literally face-to-face in the innovation process, and in just the culture of businesses. So I think there's going to be a gradual but quite substantial return to work. I think far more people will be working from home a day or two a week, but there'll still be a need for many, many people to be in the office. You're a junior person. How do you establish your personal networks? I mean, most of us have made Zoom and Teams and so forth work because we already know each other. But our graduate students who came in September, we have graduate students who have never ever been face to face with their colleagues. They're not friends. They haven't made connections. And we are social beings. The city is a social network, and that's not just Facebook, and that's not just Zoom. So you're a junior employee in a consulting firm. How do you catch the eye of your boss? How do you get tapped for the next promotion? How do you make your mark? It's much harder to do it here than when you're around the conference table, or walking out of the boardroom, having a conversation after the meeting. Those casual conversations are, I think, incredibly important in all sorts of businesses, and certainly in the innovation field. So we're going to return. There's going to be some empty space downtown for a while. It's going to be filled up. I think the other thing we have to remember, in cities like Toronto, we were bursting at the seams, particularly from a transportation point of view. We were completely over congested on both the road and transit side. If things have subsided a bit, that gives us a chance to catch up, perhaps, with our infrastructure, and a chance to grow, because we are going to keep growing. People are going to keep coming here. And so maybe this actually gives us some breathing space. So there's going to be different things, but cities are also very, very resilient. We've talked about, we could argue whether it was, what the first city was, but cities have a raison d'etre. They have a rationale. They exist for a reason, and that reason hasn't gone away. So they're going to persist.
Marianne, what comes next?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest lesson from COVID-19 is that, behavioral change is measurable. People change behavior, and we can measure that, and it affects the system, and maybe we should learn from this. Another big lesson from COVID-19 was the whole issue of resilience, right? Which sectors were actually resilient and which sectors were not? What fell apart and what did not? And who's an essential worker and who's not an essential worker, and who could sit at home and make PowerPoints all day like us, and who cannot do that and therefore has to rely on systems that are not really ideal. And I think those are some of the lessons to carry forward and think about, you know, the cities of tomorrow, and how do we, you know, maybe undo some of the messes we've done in light of what we've learned.
So taking away the lessons about, you know, who carried us through this difficult period, we'll call eventually the pandemic of 2020, 2021 or something, the COVID pandemic, who carried us through, the essential workers who carried us through, and what are the systems that we built to accommodate them, and how are we going to change them? I think absolutely. Tamer, what do you think happens next, and what do we do about it?
I see this as a two dimensions. The first one is quite theoretical. In my view, COVID brought to us some futures to the present, to see them for our own. For example, as Marianne mentioned, a future where our behavior change will impact the environment. And we now understand that we need to take that action because professors like Marianne and others have been hypothesizing if you change your behavior, the environment is going to get better. We have seen that. And the other one is that this idea between the human and the technical, that the social part of the buildings, the social part of the infrastructure is important. And we have seen that. There was a hypothesis that one day all of us are going to be working behind a digital instrument somehow, and we will be communicating and enjoying life, canoeing or something like that. We discovered that working with colleagues is good. And that hypothesis is now being reevaluated. The second dimension relates to rethinking of the systems themselves. And in one case, I'm working with the Ministry of Infrastructure about predicting the future funding. And they realize that the capacity needs for many facilities are going to change. Many of the Service Ontario services can now safely and more, I guess, progressively be done online. So do you need to build many of these? The bigger debate is about schools. Now that a good number of classes, whether by choice or by the government mandate, is going to be moving online, do we need the same capacity investments or not?
Because some of it worked. You know, I think we agree that it's been a hard time. It's been but also that we learned many things through this period, right? And some of them are good lessons that we took away about how we will continue to and be able to engage with people who aren't near to us. And be more inclusive in that. And then sometimes we learned that what we really want to do is get back to the office or back to the university, get back to the classroom, get back to our conference rooms, get back together and continue to work on the great things that we can make happen. I'm going to give one more question to Tamer, going back to Eric's talk about and Marianne's talk about the disruptions to our system, you know, the innovation in mobility that created disruption. We were being told to prepare for growth. Then came the pandemic. How realistic is it? How realistically can a digital twin simulate the decision making that's required in this, you know, tumultuous environment that we live in and can expect going forward?
Well, at a philosophical level, and I know this is a bit abstract, but the concept of co-creation and digital twinning is a fundamental shift in the way we see knowledge. We don't see knowledge as the result of what I have learned in the university as an engineer, and I come out of the university with the perfect knowledge to decide and make designs. Knowledge is evolutionary and is co-created. And we don't know what's going to happen in an evolutionary system. So for Ms. Safari, I don't think I know, and this is the good thing. It's a disruption to the system. But on the other more pragmatic way, there is many ideas. There is many scenarios that are available to us right now from a technology, from a data, from a governance point. And one way to simulate that, one way to look into that, and one way to put everything and try it on the virtual world before we do it in the actual world is to look at the digital twin. And digital twin can make us maybe perceive futures that are not just merely an extension of what we are doing right now or an upgrade of it, but could be completely different. And so it's an opportunity to see and disrupt the system and study the evolution of knowledge. but it comes with the uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen.
And what a perfect place to be talking about that at the university, you know, so to acknowledge that, you know, we take in students, you know, great students from around the world, many of them into civil engineering, some of them studying transportation, cram them full of as much as we can in 4 years with maybe a couple of optional more years, and then send them out to keep on learning. So coming back to this conference, Empowering Innovation, and if we're talking about sending people out into the world, lightning round, a minute to each of you, what would you say to empower people as they head out into the world to do great things? Eric.
Well, as I said a bit at the beginning, I think it's a great time to be going into the field because the opportunities, the challenges are huge, the stakes are high, but the opportunities are also huge. And the technologies, the data, all that stuff are giving us tools that we never had before. But the challenge is, how do we make use of those tools? And I do think some of the things we've talked about here about thinking very broadly, read widely, not just what your courses are teaching you, but you know, take that social science course, read even novels, read history, because if you want to think broadly, work broadly, you have to read broadly and be open to these things. So I think embrace the challenge, enjoy the challenge, and you know, I think students have always been idealistic when they arrive at the university. Sometimes I think we beat that out of them, or sometimes you get out into the real world, the realities of the world beat you down. I share Tamer's optimism that I think maybe there are opportunities to maintain some of your idealism as you get into the workforce and be an agent for change, and think about how you can be involved in that. That was more than a minute, sorry.
That's all right. Marianne, what is everybody's stretch goal?
No, I'm as optimistic as Eric. I think it is a great time to go into the world. We've learned a lot of things. This cohort that's going into the world right now has learned a lot more than probably any other cohort in history. Very, very valuable lessons. And I think even for us as educators, we've learned, as Eric is saying, to be less shy of telling them, go change the world. There's nothing wrong with saying that. This doesn't sound as silly as we did before, because we want those going into the world to be agents of change how organizations think, how they do business, how they, you know, make plans. We do want that. We want to encourage our students to do that.
Go forth and do good. And Tamer, we're going to leave it to you to close the show.
Well, I have been into this because many of my students tell me, help us get a career and give me an advice. And after all many years, I tell them, we got you here to be knowledgeable about a variety of things. And your role when you go out is not to enforce or apply this knowledge, but to use this knowledge to challenge the system. And this is your way to innovate something new. You look at the system that you have and don't say, how can I extend it, but say, how can I innovate in it? How can I challenge it when challenge is needed? And that's my perspective on that our role is to challenge what exists and look for a future.
And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much to our panelists for a great discussion. I see thanks popping up in the chat. So we know you're there. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found this entire Empowering Innovation Research Day enjoyable, informative, and it's going to carry you on your way to great and better things. And we hope that next time we get to see you in person. And take care, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye for now.
Hey, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.